Hi, I'm Sophie,
I'm Anisha.
I'm Eva.
and we're going to be talking today about quantifying culture, how to use Hofstede's cultural dimensions, and EWB's tiering system. Essentially, these tools are ways of quantifying and qualifying different aspects of culture. We were wondering at the start of our research for this presentation how we can use these metrics to best quantify information about culture and countries, and how we can best apply this information to Engineers Without Borders. So the first thing we wanted to look at were Hofstede's cultural dimensions. Hofstede made these dimensions quite a few years back and used a series of indices he developed to compare different countries on scales involving culture. We'll elaborate on each of these indices in the future slides. Hofstede conducted his studies in the late 60s and early 70s by identifying 4 dimensions of different cultures. He focused solely on IBM employees to do his research and compared the workspace environment of several IBM forums. He then was able to expand his research as people continued to elaborate and came up with other cultural dimensions to add on to and studied different subgroups.
So the first index is power distance. It is the degree to which less powerful members of a society accept inequality. An example of a high power distance society would have centralized organizations, more complex hierarchies, and there would be wider gaps in the amount of authority, respect, and compensation received amongst individuals within the society. In a low power distance society, supervisors and employees in the workspace are on a more level playing field. The second index is individual versus collectivism, and this describes whether or not people view themselves in terms of I or we. In a high individualistic society, there's a lot of emphasis placed on privacy and freedom, as opposed to a low individualistic society where maintaining harmony is of utmost importance, and sometimes this overrides one's own moral and personal qualms. There's also more emphasis placed on building skills and becoming a master of something. Moving on to a masculine versus feminine society, this can also be viewed as a tough versus tender culture, as Hofstede would look at it. And in a masculine society, people will tend to have stronger egos and pride, and there will be a system set up that emphasizes the importance of money and achievement, as opposed to a feminine society which supports individuals to cooperate and focuses instead of on the end goal but on the quality of life. And there's often a need for general consensus before making decisions.
So the fourth index is uncertainty and avoidance index, and a high uncertainty avoidance index would indicate that the society is rather conservative and intolerant of unorthodox beliefs and ideas, and people would generally feel like they are having a control of their lives. And on the other hand, a low uncertainty avoidance index would mean that the society is open to innovation and new ideas, and have a general sense of lower urgency. The fifth index is pragmatic versus normative, which is also called the long-term versus short-term orientation. A pragmatic, that is a long-term orientation, would indicate that modesty and education is valued in the society, and the society generally has a long-term orientation. Whereas a normative approach means that people tend to oversell themselves, and generally the society would have a short-term orientation. Our final index is indulgence versus restraint, and this is the extent to which people actually try to control their desires and impulses. So a high indulgence index means that people are open to gratification and happiness, and are generally optimistic members of the society, whereas a high restraint index means that people tend to be pessimistic and have a stricter social norm to follow.
Next, we're moving on to the tool that we used. It was an online tool we found that rated countries from 0 to 100 based on the 6 indices described earlier on. The ratings are based on studies done after Hofstede's time on different subgroups across many countries. For example, you can see that they studied commercial airline pilots, students, civil service managers, upmarket consumers with higher purchasing powers, and elites. So now we want to sort of extrapolate the results that we found using this online tool. We can see on the bar graph on the right, we're comparing the Dominican Republic to the United States ratings for each indices. For power distance, we saw that a relatively high score of 65 indicates that the Dominican Republic is a more hierarchical society. A very low score for individualism indicates that the DR places a lot more emphasis on helping each other and establishing relationships in the workplace that mirrors a family link. The high masculinity sort of emphasizes the winner takes it all mentality that many may have, that's focused on tangible results and achievement. And the very low score of 13, as you can see in the bar graph, in long-term orientation indicates that the society is more inclined to respect traditions and less inclined to make long-term plans. We wanted to look at some observations that either amended these findings we found or that supported them. And so one example we could think of that supported this hierarchical type system in Los Sanchez was that people with more money do tend to have greater influence in the community. This is seen in many community meetings when people will often regurgitate a lot of the same ideas expressed by more influential people, adding to this groupthink mentality. As for masculinity index, we thought that they seemed to be more neutral. We didn't see the winner takes all sort of phenomena happen while on the ground, but we saw that everyone seems to have each other's best interest in mind and seem to take care of each other. The normative orientation index seemed to be more aligned with our observations in that they were not as focused on long-term sustainability. For example, the tank was built without its sustainability in mind, but mainly for enhancing another person's personal and political endeavors.
Having compared the scores for the Dominican Republic and our own observations for Los Sanchez, we have some applications within the community. First of all, we would like to emphasize the fact that we shouldn't disrupt the traditions in the community. One of these traditions being the water witch system, which is not scientifically proven to be effective, but once again is a part of traditions. Furthermore, we should play on the high collectivism of the society by developing a training system for younger generations to keep up the established system. Again, playing on the high collectivism, we should also establish a maintenance schedule to ensure that this system is sustainable. Furthermore, we would like to ensure that all travel team members have developed a sense of gender differences. Specifically, translators can encourage all members of the community to speak out and acknowledge all types of opinions, especially those of women or others that are not as influential within the community. Finally, we would like to encourage long-term orientation within the community by emphasizing the necessity of maintenance of the many systems we build. For instance, waterproofing a tank is just one of the many examples that requires more long-term focus rather than simply fulfilling one's political ambitions.
We also wanted to look at what scores Tanzania received using the Hofstede's insight tools. Here you can see it in comparison to the United States. The power distance is pretty high in Tanzania, which means the society is highly hierarchical, and there are big gaps between those with power and those without. For individualism, Tanzania scored pretty low, with only 25, meaning that it's a pretty collectivist society. Masculinity was pretty neutral on the lower side, which means that according to Hofstede Insights, Tanzania focuses more on equality and community and cooperation than status and achievement. Long-term orientation was also on the lower side, meaning that the society is short-term focused and it values tradition. So we applied the dimensions from Hofstede's cultural scales to our own observations of Mkutani in Tanzania. So we found that we agreed with Hofstede's assessment that Mkutani has a pretty normative or short-term orientation. An example of this is when there was a misunderstanding between a professional mentor and a contractor in August 2017, when the contractor continued to delay work, which led to the professional mentor getting angry, not totally understanding the differences in cultural expectations of when things are completed on different timescales. Mkutani's had a pretty medium masculinity, so this is actually in contrast to what Hofstede scale said of a more feminine society, because our personal observations showed that Mkutani definitely emphasized having male voices heard, and it wasn't until there was a specific women's meeting that other voices were listened to in the community about what exactly was wanted with EWB's project there. Additionally, we did see a high restraint culture there, where many members of the community have pretty conservative Christian values, and they apply these to their children and to their family life, which is indicative of a high restraint society. How can we apply this to our work in Mkutani? First off, we could acknowledge leader status and flatter people those with power. Specifically, we need to make sure that the headmaster and other important community members feel like they're in charge, and although we can acknowledge other community members' opinions, still be careful and tactful in bringing them up to those with power. We should also foster a sense of community. A specific way to do this might be to make the water catchment system tank into a work of art and to celebrate the completion of the project with all the relevant community members. We should also use negotiation and collaboration to overall work on our project because of the collectivist tendencies of Tanzania. We should also always be professional and avoid jokes in formal settings, though we can have fun with kids and play when it's the appropriate setting. We should also make sure that in general, all travel team members are familiar with the culture of Tanzania and Mkutani specifically, to make sure that there are no misunderstandings related to cultural context.
As with many evaluation tools, there comes many flaws. There's a claim that because Hofstede's research focused solely on IBM employees, he could attribute those patterns to national differences and minimize the impact of company culture. First and foremost, the study was conducted in the 1970s, which was nearly 50 years ago, and many of the societal norms and expectations may have changed since then. The study was done on IBM workers, and IBM is a computer manufacturing company, as you may know, which in the 1970s was most likely male-dominated. And so the question is it reasonable to extend observations of this sheltered workspace environment to rural communities or even to entire countries when it overlooks all the women in the community that may not have an equal representation in this sort of IBM workspace? I think the IBM workspace also invites people with a certain degree of education, which may not be reflective of an entire population in a community or of that of a country. We also have a few critiques of how some of the cultural dimensions were defined. Masculinity versus femininity, the name is a bit misleading because it disagrees with our modern day definition of masculinity and femininity. And we can sort of see why Hofstede defined these tough versus tender cultures in the way that he did, because IBM workspaces were probably devoid of the female counterpart, so he instead defined feminism to be synonymous to a more cooperative, supportive culture. As for the low power distance index, again, reiterating that the study was on a workspace in IBM, and the inequalities that may have existed does not directly translate from the workspace to the political and social dynamics of a community or country abroad. As for low individualism, we were uncertain as to why Hofstede defined an aspect of a low individualistic society as placing more emphasis on building skills or becoming a master of something, when low individualistic society, which corresponds to a high collectivistic society, emphasizes maintaining more harmony in group setting.
So we are now shifting gears to other modes of country assessment, specifically those of EWB. So EWB prioritize their projects by having a country office candidate scoring tool. And this scoring tool includes 4 tiers, which were initially created based on the safety, security of these countries, as well as the Human Development Index, which is a UN measurement standard. EWB then set out on scoping missions to all the Tier 1 countries, except for some that have safety restraints. And they have used the country candidate office scoring tool to measure the viability of these countries as potential country office locations. Finally, EWB compares these Tier 1 countries to determine where to establish their new country office locations. The scoping missions of EWB includes visits with government officials to determine how hospitable these policies are for NGOs to set up operations within the country, as well as communications with other in-country NGOs to understand how their experiences have been abroad. Here's a visual representation of the 17 Sustainable Development Goals posed by the United Nations, otherwise known as SDG. These 17 goals include very specific needs that needs to be addressed by 2050 as documented by the UN. And the UN also produced a document that scored each country on these 17 tiers. Here's how the 2 countries that we operate in scored on the SDG. So the key part here is the global rank of each country. As Tanzania ranked 131 out of 157 countries on the SDG, it was initially placed in Tier 1 on the country office scoring tool. In contrast, Dominican Republic ranked 70 out of 157 countries, and thus the relatively higher ranks caused it to be placed in Tier 3 of the CO tool, which is of lesser urgency, rather than in Tier 1. Another metric that the EWB country office scoring tool utilizes is the HDI, the Human Development Index, which measures in 3 separate areas and utilizes 3 separate numbers: the life expectancy rate, literacy rate, and GDP per capita in these countries, with a higher number indicating a higher quality of life. This is another visual representation of the HDI in various countries, and fortunately, as you can tell, the HDI in most countries have been increasing in the past 30 years. Here are the 4 tiers that EWB country office scoring tool includes. Tier 1 countries are the ones of the greatest need, and the priority of establishing a country office will be placed in the Tier 1 countries. EWB will continue to accept project applications in Tier 2 countries, but Tier 3 country projects will be robustly vetted and undergo substantial screening. Finally, Tier 4 country projects are being phased out as of January 2018, meaning that EWB National will not be accepting any program applications in these countries.
Here are the tiers that EWB uses to rank its various programs. Tier 1 countries include Tanzania. These are where EWB is hoping to focus its future programs and projects. Tier 2 countries will have thorough vetting for its programs, but still be important. Tier 3, which includes the Dominican Republic, will have much more thorough vetting in terms of being less the places where EWB plans to focus. Tier 4 countries will eventually have all programs phased out, as EWB doesn't think these are the optimal places to continue to work. How is the country office candidate tool developed? Chris Bleers, who we'll talk about more, says that the greater impact of our communities and our volunteers will be achieved by moving towards a more strategic and focused approach to where we work and how we work. So this is essentially EWB's idea of focusing in on different places to work. So EWB hopes to continue to work more in places where developments have been successful, like in Latin America or Africa, and cut down on places where there might be more barriers. We have a quote from Natasha Cormer, a student member representative of EWB's Board of Directors. This is kind of a dark quote, but it's important for understanding why EWB made these decisions. She says, "We have to operate with the assumption that EWB-USA is unable to help all underserved communities around the world," which is true, so unfortunately we have to focus on where we are most effective and can make the biggest impact. Who developed the country office scoring tool? There were 12 members of the committee that developed this tool, consisting of volunteers, board members, staff, and mentors, all working together to make this tool effective.
The country office scoring tool evaluates 8 main areas of assessment:
safety and security, cost and logistics, community vulnerability, local partnerships, alignment with international development indices. Degree affected by climate change. And finally, current EWB-USA work.
Based on HDI and SDG indices that Eva spoke about earlier, countries are rated in 4 tiers. All the countries in Tier 1 are scoped out by EWB-USA. EWB-USA has traveled to the majority of countries under Tier 1, except for Sierra Leone, Cambodia, and Zimbabwe. Zimbabwe may be scoped out in the near future, depending on if May elections do pan out well. As you can see, politics does play a pretty big role in where to go, and determines whether or not it is feasible for these scoping missions to be carried forth, and if programs can be initiated and established in these relative countries. Now we're going to dive a little bit deeper in how the politics around the world affects directly what EWB-USA is able to do abroad. One case study is Myanmar, which has identified needs but also is undergoing many political changes, so it is very difficult for EWB-USA to go in and establish relevant connections with NGOs. Another case study is Cambodia. 2018 is the year of elections, which happen every 5 years, and there are many tense relations between the two biggest opposing parties, and this has made it difficult for EWB-USA to register a US-based INGO. And the matter of who they should work with directly comes into question when there is not a clear distinction on who may be of most assistance. We also have slight problems with the CO scoring tool in that we think it may not be updated often enough to reflect these in-country political situations. For example, what is happening in Cambodia right now may not be true for next year when there are no elections.
So what exactly are country offices? They serve a multitude of purposes, which include increasing reliance on staff experts, more accurately assessing the needs of the community, and more closely managing high-quality and timely assistance. EWB-USA currently has country offices in Nicaragua and Guatemala, but they soon project to have country offices in a total of 5 countries by the year 2020.
As you can see, these are current EWB programs by region. We define program as an all-encompassing term for multiple projects in a certain region. For example, the Tanzania program encompasses a latrine project and a schoolhouse facilitation project. We're going to shine a light on Chris Blears, the Managing Program Director of EWB-USA. We wanted to ask him how does he go about starting the relevant conversations with the relevant people in these countries that may not be as willing to welcome foreigners, willing to welcome humanitarian groups such as EWB-USA. He says it takes a meeting with relevant ministry with registers INGOs to get an understanding of the process. And this can vary widely from nation to nation. For example, in Tanzania, they may have to take a different approach because of the current circumstances wherein the government still maintains many nationalist overtones. And he believes the window is closing for many foreign agencies to register there.
Here's a visual representation of the crisis of 2018. It is important to note the presence of such crises, such as natural disasters, because they ultimately affect where EWB can place their country offices and where the programs are located. Having delved deep into the CO tool, we wanted to see if it is effective or has any shortcomings. We noted that the CO tool is effective in various ways. It is a unique, encompassing tool that references various other accredited metrics, and specifically evaluates how viable countries are for the presence of an EWB country office, and thus in-country engineering work. However, we also noted that countries rated in lower tiers or are not ranked in tiers still have communities that do not have access to basic necessities, as EWB do not want to displace engineering work in countries that have certain resources to solve the problems. The issue with this, of course, is that many countries with such resources aren't necessarily using them wisely to solve the problems. Finally, EWB CO tool also contains various subjective factors, including the compatibility with EWB's mission and vision and the level of need for small-scale engineering.
So when we set out to research this presentation, we wanted to know what the value of these various tools were. So Hofstede's modes of cultural dimensions was interesting to consider, but we definitely saw some pretty big flaws in it. The fact that it mostly evaluated IBM culture back in the early 70s means that it's pretty limited in scope and isn't always applicable to areas of development in different cultures. However, we can still take away some important comparisons of different ways of thinking in these various cultures.
In contrast, EWB's scoring tool considers many more specific and important criteria for traveling, including safety and the sustainability of certain projects within countries. Furthermore, EWB references a lot of other nationally and internationally recognized scales, such as the UN SDG and HDI indices, which indicates that this is a very effective and reliable tool, specifically for the purpose of placing EWB country candidate offices. And as the student representative of EWB board said, the CO tool is truly a unique tool in itself.
So overall, coming from this presentation, we want you to leave and consider Hofstede's evaluations with a grain of salt, and to always be mindful and receptive to different cultural dynamics while in country, which may or may not agree with what Hofstede predicts. As for the CO candidate tool, it does have many criteria that are important for honing down on the countries that do need help, though we do recognize that many other countries that are advanced and developed do still have communities that are lacking basic necessities. And while they do lack these basic necessities, there must be a way that we filter and find countries that are the best for EWB to help. And so with that, we conclude our presentation. Thank you for listening.